This is a pre-recorded lecture over Chapter 15, the Autonomic Nervous System. This material will be on exam number 2, and there is a quiz on Connect that will help guide you with your understanding of this material in addition to the regular Connect assignment. That quiz is due by noon on Wednesday, the day before the exam, and at 12:01 p.m. that exam will become available for you to review. So keep in mind that is only a day before the exam, but because the exam is on a Thursday in the middle of the week, this time I put the quiz due a little bit later so that you'll have more time to focus on the content. So the autonomic nervous system is really just a continuation of the nervous system. We spent a lot of time this semester already on the nervous system, and much of what I'll be discussing with you now should be a review. However, there will be some new concepts in here, so be listening for those. You know that the autonomic nervous system really means self-governed or fully independent. This is a part of your nervous system which is not in your conscious control. It is regulated largely by your brain stem and by your spinal cord. It does not go through the thalamus to your consciousness, and this is the part of the nervous system which is regulating your fundamental life processes such as your heart rate, your blood pressure, your body temperature, really a critical component of your overall homeostasis. Where we're heading over the next couple of chapters is really an understanding of homeostasis. That is, we'll be studying both the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system, both of which work hand in hand to maintain homeostasis. Now, the autonomic nervous system is a motor nervous system that is controlling glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. You'll recognize that those are the two muscle types which are involuntary. This is also referred to as your visceral motor system, and primarily the organs here involved are the viscera of your thoracic and abdominal cavities. Again, those structures over which you do not have direct control. There's also going to be interaction with your erector pili muscles, with your sweat glands, and with your blood vessels as we have vasoconstriction and vasodilation controlled. Now again, this system is done without your voluntary control, without your intent, most of the time without even your awareness, and your visceral effectors are constantly adapting and adjusting to your body's changing needs. If there is any sort of denervation, that is, there's a lack of innervation going to any of these organs, there can be an exaggerated response of the cardiac and smooth muscle if the nerves are severed. And we'll see even more completely when we get to the cardiovascular system that it is the vagus nerve bringing a slower heart rate for you. So your heart rate would normally be between 70 and 80 beats per minute. If you cut the vagus nerve, then your heart rate will increase 90 to 100 times per minute. So we see that losing connection to the nervous system would actually increase the cardiac response. So we'll start off with reflexes. We've already discussed reflexes this semester dealing with skeletal muscle, but now we're going to be looking at visceral reflexes. Again, these are those responses that are involuntary, and the story is much the same. In the visceral reflex arc, there's going to be a receptor, a nerve ending, but these nerve endings are going to be more often than not stretch receptors. Bladder is full, bladder is empty, stomach is full, stomach is empty, heart is being stretched with too much blood. There could also be receptors that are responding to tissue damage or to chemicals, specifically pH changes, temperature changes, and other stimuli. And as you would expect, there would be an afferent neuron that would bring that signal to the central nervous system, interneurons within the central nervous system which would receive, integrate, and take in that information, and then there'd be efferent signals out. The difference here is that the effectors would not be voluntary muscle, but instead would be involuntary smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glandular secretions. As you would also expect, visceral reflexes are going to be largely controlled by negative feedback. For example, here in this diagram, one can see the interaction of the heart. Now, you know that the heart is autorhythmic, but the autonomic nervous system does influence the heart rate. So here we're able to see that the baroreceptors, remember the baroreceptors are located in the carotid sinuses and also in the aortic arch, and those baroreceptors are sensing stretch, increased pressure in those spaces, and are sending a signal back to the central nervous system. This is being sent through the glossopharyngeal and through or from the glossopharyngeal nerve to the medulla oblongata. We'll discuss which nerves are involved with this. We'll see that both the glossopharyngeal and other nerves are involved in some of this reflex arc. And then it's from the medulla that the vagus nerve would then influence the cardiac pacemaker. So we see an integration again of cranial nerves. I have promised you over and over you won't get to forget them. So we see here the glossopharyngeal involved in sending the signal to the medulla, and then we see the vagus nerve responding back to the cardiac pacemaker. So again, we see an arc where the heart is responding in a negative feedback mechanism. Now, the autonomic nervous system is divided up into two divisions. You've heard of them, you know about them, and they have oftentimes cooperative or contrasting effects. The sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are not always direct opposites of one another, and I don't want you to think that they are complete opposites, although they oftentimes do contrasting work. They are not always truly opposite of each other. Now, the two divisions are preparing the body for physical activity, but they're also calming the body in times of energy regeneration. So we'll start off with the parasympathetic nervous system. This is that system that is going to be involving maintaining bodily functions to re-energize the body. Oftentimes waste elimination and digestion are increased during this time, and it's oftentimes named the rest and digest state. Now, there's a certain amount of autonomic tone. That is, there's a background rate of how these two systems are influencing the overall body's needs. Again, unknowns to us. So parasympathetic tone, for example, is going to help maintain smooth muscle tone in the intestines, and as I've already mentioned, holds down the resting heart rate to about 70 to 80 beats per minute. Sympathetic tone, again, a constant underlying amount of sympathetic overload, is keeping most of your blood vessels partially constricted, and that will be critical for maintaining blood pressure. Imagine if all of your blood vessels suddenly dilated, which is what happens in some shock, where everything dilates and the blood pressure drops precipitously. So we need to be able to keep our blood vessels largely in a partially constricted state, not completely constricted. We need to maintain control over this, but they are maintained largely constricted. Now, it is true that the sympathetic division excites the heart and inhibits the digestive and urinary function, and the parasympathetic have the opposite effects. But we will see some cooperative situations as well, where the two systems work hand in hand. Now, the autonomic nervous system has components in both the central and the peripheral nervous system. So recall that central nervous system, brain, spinal cord; peripheral nervous system, your peripheral nerves. And the place where all this sort of comes together is the hypothalamus. So we'll see how important the hypothalamus is to your overall We'll see how important the hypothalamus is to your overall autonomic nervous system, and we've already described how important it is to your voluntary nervous system. We'll see that the autonomic nervous system does work through motor neurons, it does work through your spinal cord, and that these nerve fibers, recall that nerve fibers or axons, will travel through both the cranial and the spinal nerves. Some of these pathways will influence the somatic motor pathway. That is, they will influence your voluntary muscles in a reflexive way. Now recall that the autonomic nervous system works in a slightly different way. That is, there's not one single neuron that sends the signal from the central nervous system to the effector as we see in normal voluntary nervous system, but there is a two-neuron system. And between those two neurons, there's a synapse. Well, this extra synapse, we know also from our conversations before, helps with overall regulation of the nervous system. It gives one more opportunity for control and regulation. So in the autonomic nervous system, we'll discuss two neurons, the presynaptic and the postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron is simply the first neuron. It is originating in the spinal cord or in the brain stem. This neuron will travel to a ganglion, to a sympathetic ganglion. There it will synapse with a post-ganglionic neuron or a postsynaptic neuron. And then that second neuron, or that post-ganglionic neuron, will then travel all the way to the target tissue or cell. So we see in the top image what we see in the somatic nervous system. That is a single neuron. It is traveling from the ventral horn of the spinal cord, traveling out the ventral root, through the spinal nerve. We see that along the way we've got myelination and Schwann cells. We see here that muscle, voluntary muscle, is the effector. Of course, this is voluntary. This is voluntary, so this would include conscious thought. We also see that the neurotransmitter used here is acetylcholine. Recall acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter which is best described and is the most common in your body and is the one that does control your voluntary skeletal muscles. Now let's compare this with the overall pathway for the autonomic nervous system. Now we have a two-neuron system. We still have the first neuron. The first neuron is going to originate more in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, and it's going to travel just to the ganglion. Now, we've seen the sympathetic chain ganglia in the nervous system lab, so we can picture them as those paravertebral ganglia. We see that the preganglionic fiber is in fact myelinated. Again, these are our Schwann cells. And we see acetylcholine is once again the neurotransmitter used. At this autonomic ganglion, the synapse is going to now influence a second soma for the postsynaptic neuron. But here's where some other changes occur. The postganglionic neuron will be an unmyelinated fiber. Also, it will release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine, not or as in it has a choice, but there would be different fibers, some of which would release acetylcholine, others of which would release norepinephrine. So again, we have a two-neuron pathway for the autonomic nervous system. Let's start with a better understanding, description of the sympathetic division. Now, the sympathetic division is also called the thoracolumbar division, and the reason is these neurons that influence or that are part of the sympathetic nervous system are going to originate from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, more specifically from the lateral horn. Also true of these is they will have a relatively short preganglionic neuron, You know that to be the case because, again, you've seen those sympathetic chain ganglia or those paravertebral ganglia. You recognize that they're only a couple of centimeters away from the spinal cord. So the trip from the spinal cord to this sympathetic chain ganglia is relatively short. It's then at the ganglia that there be the postsynaptic ganglia. Now, these ganglia, if you'll recall, were along most of the vertebral column. Typically, there will be 3 up along the cervical region, 11 in the thoracic region, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal ganglia. Now, I know I'm telling you that the overall system is called thoracolumbar, and that is true. But those ganglia are spread from the cervical down to the coccygeal region. So let's look at a cartoon of this. Again, we see the soma in the lateral horn. This will be coming from the thoracic and lumbar regions. And we see these fibers leaving and traveling only as far as the ganglion. From the ganglion, there would then be a trip to the effectors. But I also want you to see that the fibers leaving from one area of the spinal cord are able to travel up the paravertebral ganglia to other sites, down to other paravertebral ganglia, and even signals can go out to collateral ganglia. So we're going to see that there's an incredible divergence here where signals can travel to many, many places. At the top of this, it mentions that some of these signals could go to the iris, to the salivary glands, to the lungs, to the heart, and that is true. And those would be going to do what we think about the sympathetic nervous system responsible for, like decreased salivation or dilation of the eyes. But we also have signals going to the blood vessels and to the sweat glands, and certainly also to some of the viscera. Now and let me get to that point more completely here in words. We just saw it in the pictures. So each of these paravertebral ganglia is connected to a spinal nerve by 2 branches, these communicating rami. Remember, rami means a branch. Okay, so these rami are the branches. The preganglionic fibers I already showed you in the cartoon are in fact myelinated. They travel from the spinal nerve, they go to the ganglion, and because they are myelinated, these are called the white communicating ramus, or the rami. The postganglionic fibers, as we saw earlier, were unmyelinated. The lack of myelination leaves these fibers as gray in color, and so these are the gray communicating ramus. And they will form a bridge back to the spinal nerve, so there's this constant feedback. And then the postganglionic fiber will continue on to the target organ. Now what happens, continuing on with that from that picture as well, what happens once the signal gets to the ganglion? Well, some of those signals will actually end at the ganglia. So that was their, that's where they're going to go and stop. But many others will go up and down the paravertebral chain. That is, and they're going to influence other levels of the spinal cord. So something coming in at the thoracic region could go up and influence cervical or go down to sacral or coccygeal regions. And then other signals, other fibers, will actually pass straight through the chain. They won't synapse at all. And they'll go to influence the slant network nerves that we'll describe in a moment. So let's take a look at this picture. You've seen something like this before. It's a really nice, simplistic overview of the sympathetic nervous system. The point here is this. So we have the thoracolumbar region. So that would be the thoracic down to the lumbar region of the spinal cord. It is from here that the preganglionic fibers are originating. We see that they go to ganglia, however, they go up into the cervical region, and ganglia that also go down to the coccygeal region. So we appreciate that this paravertebral chain is longer than just the thoracic lumbar. We see that the fibers go a relatively short distance to these ganglia, and that these ganglia then have some choices. These ganglia can go straight through. Once they synapse, they can now synapse and go to their effector. So we see here a couple of examples where the effectors are going to the salivary glands, or telling them to not secrete as much, right? More of a mucus secretion. Or we see signals going up to the nasal passages or to the eye. Or we see them going to the heart, telling the heart to speed up, or the lungs to increase their respiration. We also see signals, though, going to the digestive organs, telling them to reduce blood flow. Also, signals going over to the erector pili muscles. We recognize that the hair stands more erect when you are scared. And also there'd be a decrease in the blood flow to the dermis that would leave a person more pale in color because that blood is being shunted to more critical organs at the time, such as the muscles. We also can see on this figure that the post-ganglionic fibers are much, much longer. So again, it's a relatively short preganglionic and a much longer post-ganglionic fiber going to the effector. So the fibers can leave the sympathetic chain by spinal nerves, by sympathetic nerves, or by the splenic nerves. So let me break those down for you. Spinal nerve routes. Some of those post-ganglionic fibers are going to exit a ganglion by way of a gray ramus. They're going to go back to the spinal nerve and travel the rest of the way to the target organ. And this is how the sweat glands, the piloerector muscles, many of the blood vessels and skeletal muscles are going to react to the sympathetic nervous system. Others are going to go to the lung, to the heart, to the esophagus. These reflexes and these responses we understand. But there's also another group of nerves that I've not yet described, and these are the splenic nerves. Now, some of these fibers from T5 down to T12 are going to pass right through that sympathetic ganglia. They're not going to synapse. They're going to go straight down to the splenic nerves. And these nerves, as we'll see in a moment, are going to be in the gut. Now, these nerves do go to a second set of ganglia, referred to as the collateral ganglia or the prevertebral ganglia, and they'll synapse there. So there's still a two-neuron system, but it does not include the sympathetic chain that we were perhaps anticipating. Now, where do these collateral ganglia go? Well, they're going to go down to the abdominal aortic plexus, some of them. And this is a group of nerves that are going to wrap around the aorta. And here we'll see the celiac, the superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric ganglia. And these are all going to be involved with your viscera. There's also going to be a solar plexus, and the solar plexus is a collective name for the celiac and the superior mesenteric celiac. So look at it in a moment in this diagram, and you notice that the nerves radiate from the ganglia like rays of a sun. That's where they get their name, solar plexus. So taking a look at this then, you see this incredible rich arrangement of nerves wrapped around the aorta, down the abdominal aorta. And you can also see these different ganglia associated with it. So the inferior mesenteric ganglia, the superior mesenteric ganglia. So again, these signals came straight down from the sympathetic nervous system. And they're going to go on to influence many of the viscera. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is predominantly divergent. That is, one neuron communicates with multiple neurons, which then continue to synapse with greater effector. So just a little bit of excitation or a little bit of signal can be modified and felt or influenced over much of the body. So an incredible widespread effect when it comes to the sympathetic nervous system. Now, one of the keys to the sympathetic nervous system are the adrenal glands. You might know them as the suprarenal glands. Remember, these are glands found in the superior poles of the kidneys. And there are really two glands in one. Much like the pituitary gland is partially epithelial and partially nervous tissue, so too the adrenal gland is like two glands in one. The outer layer, the adrenal cortex, is very different in its function from the inner or the adrenal medulla. Now, central to the sympathetic nervous system are the adrenal glands. And again, we have that double layer, the cortex, the outer layer, and that is where the steroid hormones will be produced. We'll be talking about those steroid hormones more completely in Chapter 17 when we get to the endocrine system. The inside core, the medulla of the adrenal gland, is essentially another sympathetic ganglion. In other words, it's another place where a lot of neurons come in, and basically the medulla is a large group of postganglionic neurons. They don't have dendrites, they don't have axons, but they act like that. And so they are stimulated by these preganglionic sympathetic neurons that come in and terminate on these cells. These the cells here, the medulla, is going to secrete a mixture of hormones into the bloodstream. So here we see a connection, a direct connection between the nervous system and now the production of hormones. So you can begin to better appreciate why I have grouped the endocrine system and the sympathetic nervous system together, because we're going to see this incredible connection between the two in maintaining homeostasis. Now, what is being released is a combination of catecholamines. 85% of what is released is epinephrine, also called adrenaline. Those two molecules are the same. I know it's confusing, but if you look at the names of them, epinephrine on the kidney, or adrenaline, right, the adrenal glands, which are on the kidney. So we see that the derivation of the name, the same molecule. And then there's also 15% norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline. Now, these molecules are hormonal because they go directly into the bloodstream, but they're also neurotransmitters. So again, this connection. So there's this whole sympatho-adrenal system where we see the interaction of autonomic and the endocrine system. Now let's switch our attention for a moment to the parasympathetic division. This is also called the craniosacral division because the fibers for this are going to arise from two places. Think a pair of places, right? So the parasympathetic from a pair of places from the brain, the cranium, and sacral regions. And these fibers are going to travel in some of the cranial nerves and in the sacral nerves. Now, again, they're coming from the midbrain, the pons and the medulla, brainstem areas, and from S2 through S4. Now, this division has the opposite as far as the length of the fibers. Here, the preganglionic fibers, they're not going to the sympathetic chain ganglia. So they have a rather significant trip to make before they get to their ganglia. So when we're dealing with this, the cranial nerves that are involved with the parasympathetic nervous system are 3, 7, 9, and 10. And you'll appreciate, I think, why that is as you think about what are the body's responses to a parasympathetic surge. Also, the sacral spinal nerves are going to go on to some of the other splanchnic nerves and to the inferior hypogastric plexus. Now, again, the ganglion is not a sympathetic chain ganglia. It is far away, usually near or at the target organ. So we're talking about very long preganglionic and very short postganglionic fibers. There is a lot less divergence when it comes to the parasympathetic division. You can have much more discrete or localized effects. So you don't have to have all systems on full alert. In the sympathetic nervous system, as I always say when the bear walks in the room, all systems quickly go on alert because of the divergence. Here it's possible to have more of a discrete localized effect. So let's first look at these cranial nerves that are involved. And we see three. Recall that three is narrowing the pupil, focusing the lens. Recall that in a parasympathetic moment, when you're relaxed, rest and digest, the pupil definitely constricts. So we have a smaller pupil. The facial nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve, think taste, 7 and 9. So this is not only your salivation for tasting and digestion, but also your nasal secretions and your tear production from the facial. And then the vagus nerve is going down into your viscera and is informing your colon and your digestive organs, and also has an effect on your cardiac and pulmonary and esophageal plexi. So in this picture too, you can also appreciate that the preganglionic fiber is much, much longer. Goes to the ganglion, and then the postganglionic fiber is significantly shorter. So it's just the reverse of what we saw with the sympathetic. Now those were the cranial nerves. How about those sacral nerves? They're coming off, and relatively long preganglionic fibers going to, right? We see that these nerves are going down to the colon, to the bladder, to the reproductive organs, again influencing their function. We also see signals traveling from the vagus nerve, right? Remember, the vagus nerve up here is coming down, as I already mentioned, and influencing many of the viscera. Now there's another entire nervous system that I have never discussed with you, and this is referred to as the enteric nervous system. It is absolutely mind-blowing when you consider that there are 100 million neurons found in the walls of your digestive system which do not have their direct connection from the brainstem or from the spinal cord. These nerves are innervating the smooth muscles and the glands of digestion. They have no direct component to the central nervous system. They have their own reflex arcs. And really what we're doing here is regulating the motility and the movement of digestive products from the esophagus through the digestive system, and also the release of the enzymes and acids necessary for digestion. Now, much like the heart is autorhythmic and is influenced by the central nervous system, same thing here. Normal digestive function does require regulation. It is influenced by the sympathetic and parasympathetic, but this enteric nervous system is its own system on its own. Now, what can go wrong here? Hirschsprung's disease is a hereditary defect which is described as having a lack of this enteric nervous system. So there's no internal innervation going to the colon or the rectum. And what happens is that it constricts the permeability, and feces begin to build up and impact above this area of constriction, leading to what's called megacolon. And you get this huge dilation of the bowel and abdominal distension and horrible constipation. And that can lead to a gangrene. And if that should perforate, then you're going to have peritonitis, that you're going to have those gut bacteria invading into the peritoneum, and this can be a huge, huge infection. Now, this disease, usually because these kids are born with this, is most obvious at birth. And one of the normal milestones that doctors want to see before an infant is discharged is to see their first bowel movement. And without that first bowel movement, there's always the possibility of checking out to see if they have megacolon. Now, I mentioned the neurotransmitters. We know a little bit about them. We're going to be continuing this conversation about the nervous system. This is not going away. So right now we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, and we'll discuss the endocrine system. Then the next unit after this will be the muscles and how the nervous system interacts with muscles. And then later on it'll be the nervous system interacting with other systems. So the fundamental concepts that we have learned about synapses and about action potentials will certainly be with us now for quite a while. Now, one of the questions you may have asked yourself in the past is, well, when the bear walks in the room and epinephrine is released and there's a sympathetic surge, I know that some blood vessels respond to epinephrine by increasing, right, by dilating and increasing blood flow, for example, to the muscles, whereas other blood vessels constrict. And those blood vessels now restrict the amount of blood that can go to those areas. And so the question is, how is it that one hormone or one neurotransmitter can be seen by different organs and different tissues and yet respond in a different way? And it comes down to receptors. There are different types of receptors that will respond to these hormonal and nervous neurotransmitter signals in different ways. So when we talk about sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, that is, sympathetic and parasympathetic axons, they are going to secrete different neurotransmitters. Recall that any one neuron can only release one neurotransmitter. It's not like it will release one neurotransmitter under one situation and then change gears and change its neurotransmitter. It's always the same. What's different is that the target cells can respond to one neurotransmitter differently based upon the type of receptor they have. So what we'll see is that all autonomic fibers release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine, and that there are receptor classes that receive these neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine, we've talked about acetylcholine. It is, again, the most abundant neurotransmitter. It is secreted, synthesized by all of the preganglionic neurons, regardless of division. So both in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter released by the preganglionic neurons. That means that the postganglionic neurons are all receiving acetylcholine. They're responding to it. The fibers that make acetylcholine are simply called cholinergic fibers, right? So they are axons, fibers that release acetylcholine. Then the postsynaptic neurons would have to have receptors for that acetylcholine, so we would say that they have cholinergic receptors. Now, these cholinergic receptors come in two types, muscarinic and nicotinic. Now, these names are perhaps a little bit unfortunate in that the muscarine is a molecule made from poisonous mushrooms that was shown to interact with these receptors, and nicotine also was shown to interact with these receptors, different receptors, and so the names of these are more historical names where they were first described and the name has stuck. The muscarinic receptors, again, they're cholinergic muscarinic receptors. This is what you're going to have in cardiac muscles, smooth muscle glands, and they can be excitatory or inhibitory based upon a subclass of the muscarinic. So there's not just one type of muscarinic, there's actually quite a few. Nicotinic receptors are on all of the postganglionic neurons in the medulla and at the neuromuscular junction that we'll see later on in skeletal muscle. They are all excitatory when acetylcholine occurs. So acetylcholine will always be excitatory toward a nicotinic receptor, whereas for muscarinic, it could be excitatory or inhibitory depending upon the subtype. Norepinephrine is secreted by nearly all of the sympathetic postganglionic neurons. Because they release norepinephrine, they are called adrenergic fibers. And the effectors that are receiving this norepinephrine must therefore have adrenergic receptors. Those receptors come in two basic types, alpha and beta. You may have heard of beta blockers or alpha blockers. So now we're talking about those molecules. The alpha adrenergic receptors are usually excitatory. Two subclasses, alpha 1 and alpha 2. The beta adrenergic receptors are usually inhibitory. Again, there's a beta 1 and a beta 2, two different subclasses here, but they both work through a second messenger system. So, for example, when you're thinking about autonomic systems and the effects that they have on blood vessels, sometimes there can be vasodilation, sometimes there's vasoconstriction. Again, why is it to some organs you get an increase in blood flow and to others you get a decreased blood flow? Or think about secretion of glands, increased or decreased glandular secretions. Again, it's going to come down to the receptor that is found in the target. Now, when it comes to the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic, what you'll see is that the effects of the sympathetic nervous system last longer than the parasympathetic. Part of this is because it is more divergent. There are more neurons informing other neurons. But also, remember that acetylcholine is released by the parasympathetics and is broken down more quickly, whereas the norepinephrine, which is released by the sympathetics, is reabsorbed, and it just simply takes longer. Plus, it is in the bloodstream, and anything in the bloodstream is going to take longer to resolve or to take care of than acetylcholine, which is quickly broken down at the synapse. Now, we've seen in the past, we talked about neuromodulators. Neuromodulators were other neurotransmitters which could interact with or influence, either negatively or positively, the release of other neurotransmitters or the initiation of a local potential. And so clearly, there are other molecules. Enkephalin, we mentioned enkephalin before as being something that could interact at the axon terminals. There's also substance P, neuropeptide Y. There's a whole group of these which are involved with influencing sympathetic fibers. Parasympathetic fibers also can stimulate endothelial cells, and endothelial cells can release a gas, nitric oxide, NO. NO is interesting in that it is a vasodilator, but it's a gas. So it can very quickly travel between cells, and what it does is it inhibits smooth muscle tone, which leads to them relaxing to vasodilation. We'll see later on that this nitric oxide is also critical in the action of Viagra, for example, for erectile dysfunction. So let's take a look at these neurotransmitters and the receptors just to get the names down. The names here are a little bit confusing until you think about it a little bit more. So at the very top, we have the parasympathetic fiber. Again, where would this be originating from? Right, this would be from cranial or sacral region, and it is going to have a relatively long preganglionic axon, and it will release exclusively acetylcholine. So that makes this a cholinergic fiber, doesn't it? So this is the cholinergic fiber, the preganglionic, the green one. It's going to release onto the postganglionic neuron this acetylcholine. In this case, it's a nicotinic receptor. Okay, so that's one of the subtypes of the cholinergic. So it's a cholinergic nicotinic receptor. And the postganglionic neuron, which is typically shorter, and we see that here, it's a shorter neuron, releases also acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is the only neurotransmitter released by the parasympathetic. It is released by both the preganglionic and the postganglionic. Again, this is another reason why the parasympathetic nervous system can ablate or erase its effects more quickly, because it's only dealing with acetylcholine. And then, in this example, the target cell has in it muscarinic receptors. which are going to respond to that acetylcholine in some particular way. Now let's compare that with sympathetic adrenergic. So here, again, we're dealing with the sympathetic. We have a preganglionic neuron. This is going to be starting somewhere in the thoracic lumbar region of the spinal cord. It has a relatively short preganglionic neuron and always releases acetylcholine. In this case, it's a nicotinic receptor that is found on the postganglionic neuron. We have that longer postganglionic neuron. In this case, it is an adrenergic fiber. It is releasing norepinephrine and is being received by the target cell. We can also look at cholinergic receptors. That is, the sympathetic nervous system can release acetylcholine. Okay, so it's a cholinergic receptor. Here we have a nicotinic receptor, which is then going down to release acetylcholine. So that's why it's a cholinergic, right? And here we have adrenergic fiber because it is releasing norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is always going to be found here. So acetylcholine, notice, is the same in all of the preganglionic fibers. Always, always, always acetylcholine. Now, most of your organs are receiving signals from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Oftentimes, you can think of it as being a rheostat, something that's driving things up and driving things down. Oftentimes, but not always, there are going to be antagonistic effects. That is, there's going to be an opposing effect. So the sympathetic nervous system would cause the heart rate to go up. The parasympathetic nervous system would cause the heart rate to go down. That would be an antagonistic effect where the effects are opposing each other. But there are also cooperative effects where both divisions act differently but together give a unified overall effect. And I'll give you a couple of examples of a cooperative situation. Now, both divisions do not normally innervate an organ equally. So while they're both receiving signals, for example, the digestive system is certainly more influenced by the parasympathetic and the heart rate by the sympathetic. So let's talk about these antagonistic effects. I've already alluded to the first one, and that is, you know that sympathetic is going to cause the heart rate to go up, whereas parasympathetic is going to cause the heart rate to go down. Again, antagonistic, or think about the pupils. The pupil is going to constrict during parasympathetic, and that's cranial nerve number 3, and it's going to dilate during sympathetic. But there are examples of cooperative effects when both divisions are working together. One example here is going to be in the salivary glands. Your salivary glands are considered mixed glands. So parasympathetics are going to increase watery secretions from your salivary glands in preparation of digestion and breaking down food. Whereas when the bear walks in the room, your salivary glands become much more mucousy, right? You go dry mouth. You're scared. When you're going to publicly speak, oftentimes your mouth will go dry. Well, why do you think your mouth would go dry as a response to the sympathetic? I mean, it makes sense up here, right? That you're about to eat, you need some food, you need to digest. So it makes sense you're going to have more serous, watery secretions in preparation of a meal. But why would you want to have a mucousy secretion by your salivary glands when you are scared? Well, when you're scared, your respiration goes up, and your air is passing back and forth over the trachea and your oral cavity more rapidly, which would tend to dry out those tissues. And so by having a mucus secretion, you're actually protecting the airway and the oral cavity from that excessive evaporation that would occur from the increased respiration. So looking at this dual innervation of the iris, again, we have parasympathetic coming up from cranial sacral region. This is cranial nerve number 3. And it goes to its ganglion and then goes to the pupil But there are also signals coming from the sympathetic nervous system which influence the opposing muscles, which would lead your muscle to dilate. So again, an adrenergic or sympathetic signal versus a cholinergic effect of the parasympathetic nervous system. Now there are some effects that do not receive both innervation of sympathetic and parasympathetic. For example, the adrenal medulla. Right, the adrenal medulla only receives one system. The erector pili muscles, only one. The sweat glands, only one. They're only receiving sympathetic signals. So there is nothing parasympathetic about these, but you could think, oh, during parasympathetic, there is nothing going to them, so they sort of come to a resting point, whereas during sympathetic surges, they are directly influenced. So your blood pressure is largely regulated by sympathetic fibers. You can increase your blood pressure, but it's very difficult for your parasympathetic to lower your blood pressure. You would never want to lower it too low anyway. So how does then the nervous system control if it doesn't have dual innervation? Let's think about the sympathetic tone. Again, there's always a baseline firing of the sympathetics. That's going to keep your blood vessels in a partially constricted state. And if they increase their firing, then you would constrict even further. If you decrease the firing, you would vasodilate. Again, we don't need parasympathetic influence here. We can simply turn the dial on the sympathetic nervous system to get all of the regulation that we need. Again, during sympathetic, by acting alone, no parasympathetic, you can still have opposite effects on target organs. During stress, blood vessels to the heart and muscles would dilate, of course, and to the skin would constrict. And that is shown here in this diagram. You see a blood vessel, an artery, and recall that the artery has a fair amount of smooth muscle in the tunica media, the middle layer. And so if there's this increased firing, you see the rapid number of signals, and during that strong sympathetic tone, it'll cause the constriction of the muscles and cause a narrowing, and therefore a higher blood pressure. Whereas during, and this is not shown here, but when there are fewer fibers, then the radius would increase, and this would be a weaker sympathetic, not a parasympathetic, but simply a weaker sympathetic, causing the muscles to relax and a vasodilation to occur. I should go back and mention that there is one other situation where both systems are working together, and that is in the male reproductive system when we're dealing with erection and ejaculation. So you might hear it said point and shoot. So the erection is parasympathetic, dilation of the blood vessels, increased blood flow. That is definitely parasympathetic, but ejaculation requires a cooperative sympathetic surge. So this is an example where both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system must work together for normal function. So again, parasympathetic, erection, and sympathetic necessary for ejaculation. Now, there is a central control of the autonomic functions. In other words, the brain, the involuntary part of the brain, definitely does have interaction with the autonomic nervous system. When I say nuclei, we know very well what a nucleus is, right? A cluster of cell bodies, and those cell bodies would be the cell bodies that are regulating the cardiac, or maybe the salivation or swallowing or bladder control. These are all those autonomic responses. There's also the spinal cord reflexes involved with defecation and micturition, they're also integrating with the spinal cord. So we have control over our skeletal muscle sphincters, right? But we don't have control over the autonomic. If the spinal cord is damaged, then the smooth muscles of the bladder or of the bowels are controlled by the autonomic reflexes. And so this is why people need to have bags or catheters if they no longer have control over their voluntary skeletal muscles. Then they would still have movement emptying their bladder and defecation through this autonomic. Now, just a quick mention about medications that can influence the autonomic nervous system. There are lots of drugs that can influence this. You'll look at this word and you'll see mimetrics, okay, or mimicry almost. So sympathomimetics are medications that are going to enhance sympathetic activity. They're going to increase or stimulate the receptors, or they're going to increase the amount of norepinephrine. And this is what cold medicines do, right? Cold medicines are going to dilate your bronchioles. They're going to constrict your nasal blood vessels, but they also constrict your blood vessels, causing an increase in blood pressure. So individuals with hypertension have to be careful taking cold medicines because they can really increase their blood pressure. Then there are sympoletics, and as you see the word lysis, breakdown, and these are going to block or suppress or inhibit the release of norepinephrine. And beta blockers are a good example of this. So beta blockers are medications people take to reduce high blood pressure. And the effects of those beta blockers are on the blood vessels and on the heart itself in reducing that blood pressure. Likewise, there are parasympathetics and mimetics that are going to enhance or suppress the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. There are other drugs which can interact on neurotransmitters in the central nervous system. For example, Prozac is going to block the reuptake of serotonin. And we saw serotonin in passing in the chapter 14, but this is a mood-elevating neurotransmitter. The last thing I want to say is caffeine competes with adenosine. Now, adenosine is the presence of which causes sleepiness. So caffeine will compete with adenosine and can therefore lead to sleeplessness by binding to the receptors and interfering with the sleep cycles. And my last slide here is just to show you that adenosine, which is necessary to help with sleep, has a molecular structure that has some similarities to caffeine. So this is why some individuals are more sensitive to caffeine, and caffeine can interfere with sleep cycles by mimicking adenosine. That finishes up this short chapter on the autonomic nervous system. Again, this unit will be a part of exam number 2, and I will not be discussing this directly in lecture. This will be a supplemental lecture, and I'll be discussing today the endocrine system, and then next week a little bit about skeletal physiology. And those 3 chapters, 15, 17, and 7, will be part of exam number 2.